The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitmore ranch as Sarah Chen pulled her truck up to the main house. She had driven 3 hours from the city, her heart pounding with every mile that brought her closer to this moment. The ranch looked exactly as she remembered from the photographs in the case files, but seeing it in person made everything feel more real, more urgent. She stepped out of the truck, adjusting her blazer and checking her briefcase one more time. Inside were documents that could save this place, but only if she could convince the most stubborn man in 3 counties to listen to her. Jake Whitmore had already refused to meet with her company twice, hanging up on her calls and returning her letters unopened. The ranch house sat like a fortress against the rolling hills, its weathered wood and stone construction speaking of generations who had worked this land. Cattle grazed in the distance, and she could see several ranch hands working near the barn. Everything looked peaceful, normal even. It was hard to believe this entire operation was just months away from being seized by the bank. Sarah had done her research thoroughly. The Whitmore family had owned this land for over a century, surviving drought, economic downturns, and every challenge that ranch life could throw at them. But the perfect storm of recent events had brought them to their knees. A late spring freeze had destroyed most of their hay crop, forcing them to buy expensive feed through the winter. Then summer brought the worst drought in decades, followed by a grass fire that had burned nearly a quarter of their grazing land. The final blow came when Jake's father, Thomas Whitmore, suffered a heart attack while fighting that very fire. The medical bills, combined with everything else, had pushed the ranch beyond its limits. The bank had filed foreclosure papers, and Jake had less than 60 days to come up with nearly $500,000. That's where Sarah came in. Her firm specialized in agricultural preservation, working with investors who wanted to keep family farms and ranches operational while providing the capital they needed to survive. It wasn't charity. It was business, but business that helped people keep their heritage alive. She walked up the front steps, noting how the porch boards creaked under her feet. The sound brought back memories of her own childhood visits to her grandfather's farm, before corporate agriculture had swallowed it up. That's what had driven her into this line of work, the desire to prevent other families from losing what hers had lost. Before she could knock, the front door swung open. Jake Whitmore stood there, and Sarah was struck by how different he looked from the man in the newspaper photos she'd seen. Those pictures had shown him at local cattle auctions and community events, usually smiling, looking every inch the successful rancher. The man before her now looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past few months. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with the weathered hands and sun-lined face that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. His dark hair was longer than in the photos, as if he'd been too busy or too tired to get it cut. But it was his eyes that struck her most. They held a wariness that bordered on hostility. "Miss Chen, I presume," he said, his voice flat. "I thought I made it clear that I wasn't interested in what you're selling. Mr. Whitmore, I know you're busy, and I appreciate that you've been through a lot, but I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm here to help you keep your ranch." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lady, I've heard that line from every bank, every loan company, and every fast-talking city person who's darkened my doorstep in the past 6 months. They all want to help, right up until they own my land. I understand your skepticism, but this is different. My clients aren't interested in owning your land. They want to invest in keeping it operational under your management." Jake leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "And what's the catch? Because there's always a catch." Sarah took a breath. She'd expected this resistance, but she needed to break through it somehow. "The catch is that you'd have to accept help from someone you don't know, and trust that not everyone in the world is out to take advantage of you." Something in her tone must have reached him because his expression softened slightly. "You drove a long way to get turned down at my front door. Mr. Whitmore, what if I told you that there are people who understand exactly what you're going through? People who've seen family land get swallowed up by banks and corporations, and who have the resources to prevent it from happening to others. I'd say they're probably too late. What if they're not? Jake studied her face for a long moment. Sarah could see him weighing his options, pride warring with desperation. Finally, he stepped back from the door. "You've got 10 minutes, he said. "But I'm warning you now, if this is some scheme to get me to sign over my land for pennies on the dollar, you're wasting both our time." Sarah followed him into the house, immediately struck by the warmth of the interior. The walls were covered with family photographs spanning generations, and the furniture, while well-worn, spoke of comfort and love rather than poverty. This was a home, not just a house. Jake led her to the kitchen, where she could see the mountain of papers spread across the table. Bills, bank statements, legal documents. It painted a clear picture of a man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. "Coffee?" he offered, and she nodded gratefully. As he poured 2 cups, Sarah organized her thoughts. She'd given this presentation dozens of times, but something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the photographs on the walls, or the way Jake's hands shook slightly as he handed her the cup. This wasn't just about numbers and investment returns. This was about saving a way of life. "Mr. Whitmore, before I explain my proposal, can you tell me what this ranch means to you?" He looked surprised by the question. "What kind of question is that?" "An important one. Most people hear about our program and want to know about interest rates and repayment terms. You haven't asked about any of that." Jake sat down across from her, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. "This land has been in my family since 1889. My great-great-grandfather came here with nothing but a wagon and a dream, and he built something that lasted. Every generation since has added to it, improved it, made it better for the next one." His voice grew quieter. "When my father had his heart attack, the last thing he said to me before they loaded him into the ambulance was, 'Don't let them take the land.' He didn't ask about the medical bills or worry about his own recovery. He was thinking about this place. How is your father doing now? Better, physically, but watching him realize that we might lose everything anyway." Jake shook his head. "It's killing him slower than the heart attack would have." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Mr. Whitmore, what I'm about to show you isn't a loan. It's not a buyout disguised as help. It's a partnership." She spread several documents across the table, pushing aside some of the bills to make room. "My clients are the Morrison Foundation. Have you heard of them?" Jake shook his head. "They're a family that made their fortune in technology, but their roots are in agriculture. David Morrison's grandfather lost his farm during the Depression, and David has never forgotten the stories his father told about what that loss did to their family. When David sold his company last year, he decided to use part of the proceeds to help other families avoid that same fate." Sounds too good to be true. "I thought so too when I first heard about it, but I've been working with them for 2 years now, and we've saved 17 family operations so far. Farms in Iowa, a dairy in Wisconsin, a horse ranch in Montana. All of them are still operating, still owned by the families who've worked them for generations." Sarah pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. "This is the Patterson family in Nebraska. They were 3 weeks away from losing their corn farm when we stepped in. That picture was taken at their harvest festival last month." Jake studied the photo, which showed a large family gathered around a dinner table, all of them smiling. What did they have to give up? Nothing in terms of ownership. They maintained complete control of their operation. What they did was accept an investment that allowed them to pay off their debts and modernize their equipment. In return, the foundation receives a percentage of profits for 10 years. And after 10 years, the partnership dissolves and they own everything free and clear. Or they can choose to extend the partnership if it's been beneficial for both sides. Jake was quiet for a long time, reading through the documents Sarah had brought. She could see him trying to find the trap, the hidden clause that would turn this opportunity into another disaster. "Why us?" he finally asked. "You said you've worked with 17 families. There must be thousands of farms and ranches in trouble. How did you choose the Whitmore Ranch?" Sarah had been hoping he wouldn't ask that question because the answer was personal in a way that might make him more suspicious rather than less. But she'd learned that honesty was usually the best approach. "Because I grew up on a ranch not too different from this one. My grandfather raised cattle in Oregon, and when he got sick, my father couldn't keep up with the payments. We lost everything when I was 12. I watched my grandfather sit on the front porch of our house as strangers loaded our cattle onto trucks and drove them away." She paused, remembering. "He died 6 months later. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I think it was really heartbreak. My father never got over it either. He spent the rest of his life working for other people on land that should have been ours." "I'm sorry," Jake said, and she could hear that he meant it. "The point is, I know what it feels like to watch your heritage disappear. I know what it does to a family, and I know that sometimes accepting help is the hardest thing you can do, especially when you've been raised to be self-reliant." Jake stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the ranch. Sarah could see cattle grazing in the distance and several horses near the barn. It was beautiful land, the kind of place people dreamed about but rarely got to experience. "If I say yes to this," he said without turning around, "what happens next?" "We bring in a team to assess the ranch's current value and potential. We work with your accountant and lawyer to structure the partnership in a way that protects your interests. Then we provide the capital you need to pay off the bank and get back on solid footing." "How long does all that take?" "If you're willing to move quickly, we can have everything in place within 3 weeks. Jake turned back to face her. "The bank wants their money in 8 weeks. Then we have time, but not much to waste." He sat back down, looking at the papers again. "Miss Chen, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer." "Of course. Is this real?" "Because if you're here to take advantage of a desperate man, I need to know now. I don't have time for games, and I can't afford to make the wrong choice." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw the exhaustion there, the weight of carrying so much responsibility alone. "Mr. Whitmore, 3 years ago I was working for a bank in Seattle. A good job, good money, nice office. But every time we foreclosed on a family farm, I felt a little piece of my soul die." She gathered the documents and slid them across to him. "I left that job to do this work because I believe that some things are worth more than profit margins. Your ranch is one of those things." Jake was quiet for several minutes, reading through the papers more carefully. Finally, he looked up at her. "I need to discuss this with my father. And I'll want my lawyer to look everything over." "Of course. That's exactly what you should do. If I decide to move forward, what would you need from me?" "Just a commitment to be partners in saving this place. Everything else we can figure out together." Outside, Sarah could hear the sound of ranch hands working, the distant lowing of cattle, the everyday sounds of a working ranch. It was exactly the kind of life she'd lost when she was 12, and exactly the kind of life she was trying to help other families keep. As they talked through the details, Sarah found herself hoping more than was probably professional that Jake would accept the offer. There was something about his quiet determination, his obvious love for this land, that reminded her of her grandfather, and she knew that if they lost this ranch, it would be more than just another business failure. It would be the end of a way of life that was becoming rarer with each passing year. When their meeting ended, Jake walked her back to her truck. The afternoon sun was lower now, casting everything in golden light that made the ranch look even more beautiful. "Ms. Chen," he said as she opened the truck door, "thank you for coming. Even if this doesn't work out, I appreciate that someone cares enough to try." "It will work out, Mr. Whitmore. I have a good feeling about this." As she drove away, Sarah watched the ranch disappear in her rearview mirror. She'd done everything she could to present the opportunity clearly and honestly. Now it was up to Jake to decide whether he could trust a stranger with his family's future. She didn't know it yet, but that decision would be tested much sooner than either of them expected, in ways that would prove whether their partnership was strong enough to survive the ultimate trial. 3 days later, Sarah was in her hotel room in town when her phone rang. It was Jake, and she could immediately tell something was wrong. "Ms. Chen, we need to talk. There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "The kind that changes everything. Can you get out here tonight?" Sarah looked at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. "Of course. Is everything okay?" "I'll explain when you get here." "But Sarah—" He paused, and she realized it was the first time he'd used her first name. "I think I'm going to need that help you offered, and I'm going to need it faster than we planned." As Sarah drove through the darkness toward the ranch, she had no idea that by morning both she and Jake would be facing a test that would prove whether some partnerships are forged in paperwork and others are forged in fire. Sarah arrived at the ranch to find Jake standing in the yard, his face illuminated by the porch light and the glow from his phone screen. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he paced back and forth like a caged animal. "Jake, what's happened?" she called out as she stepped from her truck. He looked up, relief visible on his face. "Thank you for coming so quickly. We need to go inside. There's a lot to explain." As they walked toward the house, Sarah noticed several vehicles she hadn't seen during her previous visit: a sheriff's deputy's cruiser, a fire department truck, and what looked like an insurance adjuster's sedan. Her stomach tightened with apprehension. Inside, the kitchen table that had been covered with financial documents 3 days ago was now buried under a different kind of paperwork: incident reports, insurance forms, and what appeared to be legal documents with official seals. "Sarah, I want you to meet my father, Thomas Whitmore." An older man rose from the kitchen chair, and Sarah immediately saw where Jake got his quiet strength. Thomas Whitmore was clearly recovering from his heart attack. He moved carefully and his face was still pale, but his handshake was firm and his eyes sharp. "Ms. Chen, my son tells me you might be able to help us save this place." "I certainly hope so, Mr. Whitmore." But Jake sounded like something urgent had happened. Jake ran his hands through his hair. "Remember how I told you about the grass fire that burned part of our grazing land earlier this year?" "Yes. The one that happened when your father had his heart attack." "Well, the insurance company has been investigating the cause of that fire for months. Today they delivered their final report." He picked up a thick document from the table and handed it to her. "They're claiming the fire was started by faulty electrical wiring in our old barn, and they're refusing to pay the claim." Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. "How much was the claim worth?" $230,000, Thomas said quietly. "Money we were counting on to help with the debt." "But that's not the worst part," Jake continued. "The insurance company is saying that since the wiring was apparently not up to current code, we're liable for the fire spreading to our neighbor's property. The Henderson Ranch lost about 50 acres of grassland and some fencing." Sarah sat down heavily. "How much are they claiming for damages?" $180,000 plus their legal fees. The numbers hit Sarah like a physical blow. She quickly did the math. The ranch was already facing a debt of nearly $500,000 to the bank. Now they were looking at another $400,000 in insurance complications. Even the Morrison Foundation's resources had limits. "There's more," Jake said grimly. "The county fire marshal is suggesting that all our outbuildings need to be inspected and brought up to current electrical code before we can get insurance coverage anywhere else. The preliminary estimate for that work is another $100,000. Sarah studied the insurance documents, her mind racing. She'd dealt with situations like this before. Rural properties where older infrastructure met modern safety requirements, and the costs became astronomical. "Jake, Have you had an independent electrician look at that barn? That's actually why I called you tonight. Bill Henderson, our neighbor. He was here this afternoon with his lawyer, but he also brought his brother-in-law who happens to be a master electrician. Tom looked at the remains of that barn, and he's not convinced the insurance company's investigator got it right. Thomas Whitmore leaned forward. Tom Henderson has been doing electrical work in this county for 30 years. He knows every building code forward and backward. He says the burn pattern doesn't match what you'd see from faulty wiring. What does it match? Lightning strike, Jake said. We had a hell of a storm the night that fire started. Tom thinks lightning hit the barn and the investigator either missed the evidence or chose to ignore it. Sarah felt a spark of hope. Can he prove that? He thinks so, but it would require bringing in a forensic electrical engineer, and that costs money we don't have. How much money? About $15,000 for a complete analysis. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. The Morrison Foundation had dealt with insurance disputes before, and they had resources the Whitmore family lacked. But this was happening before any partnership agreement was even signed. Jake, if we can prove the fire was caused by lightning, what happens to the insurance claims? Our policy covers lightning strikes. We'd get the full payout on our claim, and the neighbor's claim would shift to an act of nature, which means no liability for us. So we're talking about a $15,000 investment that could potentially save over $400,000? In theory, yes. But there's no guarantee the analysis will prove what Tom thinks it will prove. Sarah looked around the kitchen, taking in the family photos on the walls, the worn but comfortable furniture, the sense of history that filled every corner of the room. These weren't people looking for a handout. They were facing a perfect storm of bad luck that threatened to destroy everything their family had built. I need to make a phone call, she said finally. It's almost 10 o'clock at night, Jake pointed out. David Morrison told me to call him any time, day or night, if I found a situation that needed immediate attention. She stepped outside onto the porch and dialed the number. David Morrison answered on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting for her call. Sarah, what's happening? She explained the situation quickly, emphasizing both the potential costs and the potential savings. David listened without interrupting, asking only a few clarifying questions. You trust this electrician's assessment? He asked finally. I trust Jake Whitmore's judgment, and he trusts Tom Henderson. Sometimes that's all you have to go on. And you believe the Whitmore ranch is worth saving even with these complications? Sarah looked through the kitchen window at Jake and his father. Their heads bent over the insurance documents, still fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. David, this is exactly the kind of family your foundation was created to help. They're not looking for easy money or a way out of responsibility. They're fighting to save something that's been in their family for over a century. Okay. Authorize the electrical analysis. And Sarah? Yes? If this proves the fire was caused by lightning, I want you to fast-track the partnership agreement. Don't wait for the usual 30-day evaluation period. Understood. Thank you, David. When Sarah returned to the kitchen, both men looked at her expectantly. The Morrison Foundation will cover the cost of the electrical analysis, she said. We can have a forensic engineer here within 48 hours. The relief on Jake's face was immediate and profound. Sarah, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is still a gamble, but it's a gamble worth taking. Thomas Whitmore stood up slowly. Ms. Chen, may I ask why you're doing this? You barely know us. Sarah considered her answer carefully. Mr. Whitmore, when I was 12 years old, my family lost our ranch because nobody was willing to take a chance on us when we needed it most. I can't change what happened to my family, but maybe I can change what happens to yours. The next day passed in a blur of phone calls and arrangements. The forensic electrical engineer, Dr. Patricia Wells, arrived from Denver with a truck full of specialized equipment. She was a serious woman in her 50s who had spent 20 years investigating electrical failures for insurance companies and law enforcement agencies. Sarah watched Dr. Wells work, methodically photographing every inch of the burned barn's remains, taking samples of charred wood and melted metal, using instruments she'd never seen before to measure things she didn't understand. Jake spent most of the day pacing nervously, checking on the work, but trying not to interfere. Sarah found herself studying him, noting how he interacted with his ranch hands, the way he automatically checked on the cattle as he moved around the property, the unconscious way he picked up tools that had been left out and returned them to their proper places. This was a man who belonged on this land, she realized. Not because he owned it, but because he understood it in a way that couldn't be taught or bought. That evening, Dr. Wells asked them to gather in the kitchen for her preliminary findings. She spread a series of photographs across the table, each one showing different aspects of the electrical damage in the barn. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you about the storm on the night of the fire. Do you remember any lightning strikes that seemed particularly close?" Jake nodded. "There was one that lit up the whole sky, and the thunder came almost immediately. Scared the cattle pretty badly." "Where were you when you heard it?" "In the house, but I went outside to check on things maybe 10 minutes later. That's when I saw the fire." Dr. Wells pointed to one of the photographs. "This is what's left of your electrical panel in the barn. Do you see this burn pattern here?" She traced a line with her finger. "This is characteristic of an electrical surge that came from outside the system, not from a wiring failure inside it." Sarah felt her heart start to race. "What does that mean?" "It means the insurance investigator was looking at the evidence backwards. The electrical system wasn't the source of the fire. It was damaged by the fire. And the fire was almost certainly started by a lightning strike to the roof of the barn." Jake sat down heavily in his chair. "You can prove this?" "I can prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. I'll have my full report completed within 3 days, but I'm confident in saying that this fire was an act of nature, not negligence on your part." The silence that followed was broken by Thomas Whitmore's quiet voice. 40 years I've been dealing with insurance companies, and this is the first time one of their investigators got it completely wrong. Unfortunately, it happens more often than you might think, Dr. Wells said, especially with older agricultural buildings. Investigators sometimes see outdated wiring and assume it must be the cause of any electrical fire. That night, after Dr. Wells had returned to her hotel and the legal documents had been packed away, Sarah found herself sitting on the front porch with Jake and his father. The evening was clear and cool, with more stars visible than she ever saw in the city. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "When you first came here, I was convinced you were just another person trying to take advantage of our situation. I was so focused on protecting what we had left that I almost missed the chance to save it. You were being cautious. That's not something to apologize for. My father always taught me that you judge people by what they do when there's nothing in it for them," Thomas added. "You authorized that electrical investigation before any partnership agreement was signed. You took a risk on us when you had no obligation to do so." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about what they'd all been through in the past few days. "Mr. Whitmore, the partnership agreement is just paperwork. The real partnership began when you trusted me enough to let me into your home and show me what this place means to you." "So where do we go from here?" Jake asked. "First, we get Dr. Wells's report and use it to straighten out the insurance situation. Then we move forward with the foundation's investment. With the insurance money, you'll have enough to pay off the bank and fund the improvements you need to make this ranch even more successful." Jake was quiet for a long time, looking out over the land his family had worked for generations. "You know, 3 days ago I was convinced we were going to lose everything. Tonight it feels like we might actually have a future." "You always had a future, Jake. You just needed the right partner to help you reach it." As they sat in comfortable silence, Sarah realized that this case had become more than just another business deal for her. She'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a sense of completion, of coming full circle. Her grandfather's ranch was gone forever, but helping to save the Whitmore Ranch felt like honoring his memory in the best possible way. The next morning brought another challenge, one that would test everything they'd worked for. Sarah was awakened at dawn by pounding on her hotel room door. Jake's voice came through the wood, tight with urgency. "Sarah, you need to come out to the ranch right now. We've got a problem." She dressed quickly and followed Jake's truck through the early morning darkness, her mind racing with possibilities. When they reached the ranch, she immediately saw what had him so worried. The main barn, the one that housed most of their equipment and feed, was on fire. Ranch hands were already fighting the blaze with garden hoses and whatever equipment they could find, but it was clear they were losing the battle. In the distance, Sarah could hear the wail of approaching fire trucks. "How did this start?" she shouted over the noise. "We don't know," Jake shouted back. "Tom found it when he came to do the morning feeding. It was already burning pretty good by then." Sarah watched in horror as flames consumed the building that represented so much of the ranch's infrastructure. Even with insurance, this fire would set them back months, maybe years. But as she watched Jake organize the firefighting effort, directing his men to save what they could while staying safe, she realized something important. This ranch wasn't just buildings and equipment. It was people, and people who were willing to fight for what they believed in, people who took care of each other, people who refused to give up even when everything seemed lost. Those were the people worth saving. Those were the people worth taking a chance on. As the fire department arrived and began their professional attack on the blaze, Sarah found herself standing next to Thomas Whitmore, both of them watching Jake work alongside the firefighters to save what remained of the barn. "That boy has been fighting for this place his whole life," Thomas said quietly. "But tonight, for the first time, he's not fighting alone." Sarah nodded, understanding what he meant. The partnership wasn't just about money or business agreements. It was about being there when the fire came, literally and figuratively. It was about proving that some things were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. As dawn broke over the smoking remains of the barn, Sarah realized that the real test of their partnership was just beginning. But looking at Jake's determined face as he surveyed the damage and immediately started planning how to rebuild, she knew they were going to pass that test. Some partnerships were made in boardrooms, with handshakes and signed contracts. Others were forged in moments like this, when everything was on the line and people showed who they really were. The Whitmore Ranch was going to survive, she was certain of that now. But more than that, it was going to thrive, because it was built on something more solid than buildings or even land. It was built on the kind of people who would step into the fire for what they believed in, and the kind of partnerships that could withstand any storm. The morning after the barn fire, Sarah stood in the charred remains of what had been the heart of the ranch operation. The structure that had housed expensive equipment, winter feed supplies, and tools accumulated over decades was now nothing more than twisted metal and ash. Fire Chief Martinez finished his investigation and approached Jake with a grim expression. "I'm sorry, Jake. We couldn't save much. The building is a total loss, and most of the equipment inside is too damaged to salvage." Jake nodded, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had fought fires twice in 1 year and lost both times. "What about the cause? Was it electrical like the other barn?" "That's the strange part. This doesn't look electrical at all. The burn pattern suggests the fire started in the hay storage area. Could have been spontaneous combustion if the hay was stored too wet, but..." Chief Martinez paused, looking uncomfortable. "But what?" Sarah asked. "Well, Tom Henderson was here earlier with his brother-in-law, the electrician. They found something you should see." Chief Martinez led them to the back corner of the burned barn, where Tom Henderson was crouched down examining something in the debris. When he saw them approaching, he stood up, holding a piece of charred metal. "Jake, this is part of a camping lantern, the kind that runs on propane canisters," Tom said. "I found it right where the fire started, along with what's left of a gas canister." "I don't understand," Jake said. "We don't store camping equipment in the barn." Tom exchanged glances with Chief Martinez. "Jake, somebody set this fire on purpose. This lantern was placed in the hay, probably with the gas turned on to feed the flames once it started." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Arson. Someone had deliberately burned down the barn, knowing it would devastate the ranch's ability to operate. "Who would do something like this?" she asked. Jake's face had gone pale, but his voice was steady when he answered. "I have an idea." 2 hours later, they were sitting in Sheriff Patterson's office in town. The sheriff, a lean man in his 60s who looked like he'd been dealing with rural crime for most of his adult life, listened carefully as they explained what Tom Henderson had found. "Jake, you mentioned you have an idea who might be responsible. You want to share that with me?" Jake looked uncomfortable. "Sheriff, I hate to accuse anyone without proof, but there's been some tension with Marcus Webb over the water rights to Miller Creek. Sarah had heard about water rights disputes in agricultural areas, but she'd never seen one up close." "What kind of tension?" "Miller Creek runs through both our properties," Jake explained. "My great-grandfather negotiated the original water-sharing agreement with the Webb family back in 1923. We each get to use the water for irrigation during different parts of the growing season." "Let me guess," Sheriff Patterson said. "Marcus wants to change the agreement." "He wants to buy our water rights entirely. He's offered to purchase them several times over the past year, and I've turned him down every time. The last time we talked, about 3 weeks ago, he said I'd regret not taking his offer." Sheriff Patterson made notes in his file. "Did you take that as a threat?" "At the time, I thought he just meant I'd regret it financially when the bank foreclosed. But now you're wondering if he meant something else," Sarah finished. "Marcus Webb has always been aggressive in business," the sheriff said. "But arson is a big step up from sharp dealing. We'll need more than suspicion to pursue this." Chief Martinez spoke up. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about the timing of this fire. If someone wanted to destroy the ranch's ability to operate, they couldn't have picked a worse time for Jake and his family." "What do you mean?" "Well, Jake's already facing foreclosure. If he can't operate the ranch efficiently because he doesn't have barn space or equipment, he can't generate the income he needs to pay off the bank. Even with insurance money, it'll take months to rebuild and replace everything." Sarah felt sick as she realized the full implications. "Someone is trying to force you into bankruptcy before you can complete the partnership with the Morrison Foundation." "But who would know about the foundation?" Jake asked. Sheriff Patterson looked up from his notes. "How many people knew about your partnership discussions?" "Not many. My father, my lawyer, my accountant." Jake paused. "And I mentioned it to Marcus Webb the last time he offered to buy our water rights. I told him I had other options besides selling to him." The silence in the room was heavy. Sarah could see the pieces falling into place in everyone's minds. If Marcus Webb knew about the foundation partnership, he would also know that his chances of acquiring the water rights were about to disappear entirely. "Sheriff, what kind of evidence would you need to pursue charges?" Sarah asked. "Something that places Webb at the scene or connects him to the purchase of the camping equipment. The lantern and gas canister are common brands, sold at dozens of stores in the region. Without receipts or witnesses, they don't prove much." Chief Martinez stood up. "I'll send the lantern to the state crime lab for fingerprinting and any other forensic evidence. It's a long shot, but sometimes we get lucky." As they left the sheriff's office, Sarah could see the weight of everything settling on Jake's shoulders. He'd been fighting to save his ranch for months, and just when success seemed within reach, someone was actively working to destroy it. "Jake, we're not going to let this stop us," she said, as they stood beside their vehicles on the courthouse square. "Sarah, even if we catch whoever did this, the damage is already done. I can't run cattle efficiently without barn space. I can't store feed or equipment. The insurance will pay for replacement cost, but it'll take 6 months to rebuild, and I don't have 6 months." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then an idea began to form. "What if you didn't have to wait 6 months?" "What do you mean?" "What if we could find temporary facilities to keep you operating while we rebuild?" Jake looked at her skeptically. "Sarah, barn space isn't something you can just rent around here. Every rancher needs their own facilities." "Maybe not every rancher." That afternoon, Sarah found herself driving to the Henderson Ranch, the same neighbors who had suffered property damage in the first fire. She'd called ahead, and Bill Henderson had agreed to meet with her, though he'd sounded puzzled about what she wanted to discuss. The Henderson Ranch was smaller than the Whitmore operation, but well-maintained and clearly successful. Bill Henderson met her at his front door, a man in his 70s who moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with large animals and dangerous machinery. "Ms. Chen, Tom told me about the fire at Jake's place last night. Terrible thing. What can I do for you?" "Mr. Henderson, I have a proposition that might sound unusual, but I hope you'll hear me out." She explained the situation with the partnership, the insurance investigation that had cleared the Whitmores of liability for the first fire, and now the suspected arson of the second barn. "Jake needs temporary barn space and equipment storage while he rebuilds," she concluded. "I know it's a lot to ask, but would you consider a rental arrangement?" Bill Henderson was quiet for a long time, looking out over his own operation. "Ms. Chen, I appreciate what you're trying to do for Jake. The Whitmores are good people, always have been. But sharing barn space, that's asking both operations to work around each other's schedules, deal with each other's equipment, basically learn to operate as one big ranch instead of two separate ones. I understand the complications. The Morrison Foundation would be willing to compensate you fairly for the inconvenience and any additional costs." "It's not about money," Henderson said. "It's about whether two family operations can work together without driving each other crazy." Sarah waited, sensing that he was working through the idea in his mind. "On the other hand," he continued, "Jake helped me out during my father's funeral last year, brought his crew over to handle my cattle for 3 days without being asked, and Tom's been helping him with electrical work at no charge. So there's precedent for cooperation between your families." "More than that," Henderson said, "there's friendship, and friendship matters more than business around here." That evening, Sarah arranged a meeting between the Henderson and Whitmore families. They gathered around the Henderson kitchen table, maps of both ranches spread out before them, working out the logistics of combining operations temporarily. "The biggest challenge will be the cattle," Bill Henderson explained. "We'll need to keep the herds separate, but coordinate pasture rotation so we're not competing for the same grazing areas." Jake nodded. "I can move my equipment to your north barn if you can spare the space. Most of my feed was destroyed in the fire, but I can get replacement supplies delivered wherever it's convenient." "What about the water rights situation?" Sarah asked. "If Marcus Webb is behind the arson, won't this cooperative arrangement complicate things legally?" Tom Henderson, the electrician, spoke up. "Actually, it might solve the water problem entirely. If two ranches are operating in partnership even temporarily, they can negotiate water usage as a single entity rather than competing interests." The discussion continued for 2 hours, working through dozens of details that Sarah would never have considered. Feed schedules, veterinary care, equipment maintenance, insurance liability, labor coordination. Running a ranch, she was learning, involved countless interdependent systems. But what impressed her most was the willingness of both families to make the arrangement work. These weren't just neighbors helping neighbors. This was a community coming together to ensure that everyone could succeed. "There's one more thing we should discuss," Jake said as the meeting was winding down. "If Marcus Webb is really behind the arson, he's not going to be happy about this cooperative arrangement. It prevents the water rights from coming up for sale, and it keeps both ranches operating successfully." "You think he might try something else?" Bill Henderson asked. "I don't know. But we should be prepared for the possibility." The next morning, Sheriff Patterson called with news about the arson investigation. The state crime lab had found fingerprints on the camping lantern, and they matched someone in the criminal database. "The prints belong to Danny Morrison. No relation to your foundation people, Jake. He's a small-time criminal with a record of burglary and vandalism. We picked him up this morning." "Did he admit to setting the fire?" Sarah asked. "He did more than that. He gave us the name of the person who hired him. Seems Danny needed $500 to make bail on another charge, and someone offered him exactly that amount to start a little fire at the Whitmore Ranch." Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. "Marcus Webb?" "That's what we're about to find out. Danny's agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. We're setting up a controlled phone call this afternoon." The controlled call took place at the sheriff's office, with Sarah and Jake listening on headphones, while Danny Morrison called the number he claimed Webb had given him. "Mr. Webb, it's Danny. I did that job you wanted, but there's a problem." Webb's voice came through the speakers clearly. "What kind of problem?" "The sheriff's been asking questions about the fire. I think someone might have seen me." "That's your problem, not mine. Our business is finished. Maybe we could discuss some additional compensation for the extra risk." There was a long pause. "I don't know what you're talking about. I never hired you to do anything." Sheriff Patterson motioned for Danny to keep talking. "Come on, Mr. Webb. You paid me $500 to burn down Jake Whitmore's barn. I did the job, but now I need more money to get out of town." "You're crazy. I never paid you anything, and I don't know anything about any fire." The call ended abruptly. Sheriff Patterson shook his head. Smart enough not to incriminate himself directly, but stupid enough to not hang up immediately when Danny mentioned the fire. "Is that enough to arrest him?" Sarah asked. "Probably not for arson, but it's enough to get a warrant to search his property and financial records. If he paid Danny in cash, there might not be a paper trail, but people sometimes get careless." 3 days later, the search warrant turned up exactly what they needed. In Marcus Webb's home office, investigators found a receipt for the camping lantern and gas canister, purchased 2 days before the fire. They also found a handwritten note with Danny Morrison's phone number and the words, "Barn job, $500. Webb was arrested and charged with arson, criminal conspiracy, and attempted insurance fraud. Within hours of his arrest, his lawyer was calling Jake with an offer to settle all water rights disputes and pay for damages to both ranches. "He's scared," Jake explained to Sarah as they walked through the rebuilt barn 6 months later. "His lawyer knows that if this goes to trial and he's convicted, he could be looking at 20 years in prison." The new barn was larger than the old one, built with modern electrical systems and fire suppression equipment that would prevent future disasters. The partnership with the Morrison Foundation had provided not just the capital to rebuild, but the expertise to build better. "Have you decided whether to accept his settlement offer?" Sarah asked. "We're going to let him sweat for a while longer," Jake said with a slight smile. "Bill Henderson thinks we should hold out for a full confession and a public apology. He says the community needs to know that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." They walked outside, where Sarah could see cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that showed no signs of the fires that had threatened to destroy everything. The Henderson and Whitmore operations had worked so well together during the rebuilding process that they'd decided to continue some of their cooperative arrangements permanently. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," Jake said as they reached her truck. "Of course." "The partnership with the Morrison Foundation has been everything you promised and more. But I'm curious. What's next for you? Another ranch in trouble? Another family facing foreclosure? Sarah had been asking herself the same question. The success with the Whitmore Ranch had brought her more than just professional satisfaction. It had given her a sense of completion she hadn't expected. Actually, I've been thinking about that. David Morrison has offered me a promotion to head up the Foundation's agricultural division. It would mean more responsibility, a bigger budget, the ability to help even more families. But it would also mean more time in boardrooms and less time on ranches, more paperwork and fewer conversations like the ones we've had. Jake nodded, understanding. Sometimes success comes with costs you don't expect. Exactly. I got into this work because I wanted to help families keep their land. The question is whether I can help more families from an executive office or from the passenger seat of a pickup truck. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land that had been saved, not just by money, but by people willing to trust each other when everything was on the line. Whatever you decide, Jake said finally, I hope you remember that what you did here wasn't just business. You saved something that mattered, and you did it by believing in people when they couldn't quite believe in themselves. As Sarah drove away from the Whitmore Ranch that evening, she thought about the phone call she needed to make to David Morrison. The promotion was an honor and an opportunity, but it wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was to find the next family facing impossible odds, the next ranch on the verge of foreclosure, the next situation where someone needed to step into the fire and fight for what mattered. Because she'd learned something important during her time with the Whitmores. Some partnerships were about money and contracts, but the ones that really mattered were about people willing to trust each other with their dreams. And there were always more dreams worth fighting for. 6 months later, Sarah was standing in another ranch kitchen, looking at another table covered with bills and foreclosure notices, listening to another family explain how a century of hard work was about to disappear. But this time, she wasn't nervous about the conversation. She'd learned that sometimes the best partnerships began with someone willing to push aside the hand of despair and step into the fire of possibility. And she'd discovered that when you were willing to take that step, you were rarely stepping alone. The Whitmore Ranch was thriving, stronger than ever because of the challenges it had survived. Marcus Webb had accepted a plea agreement that included full restitution and a permanent injunction against any interference with the water rights. The Henderson-Whitmore cooperation had become a model for other neighboring ranches facing similar challenges. Most importantly, Jake had proven that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of wisdom, and Sarah had proven to herself that some chances were worth taking, especially when they involved helping people fight for what they loved most. As she opened her briefcase and began explaining the Morrison Foundation's partnership program to another desperate family, Sarah smiled. Because she knew that somewhere out there, Jake Whitmore was probably dealing with the everyday challenges of running a successful ranch, secure in the knowledge that when the next crisis came, he wouldn't have to face it alone. And that knowledge made every difficult conversation, every complicated negotiation, every risk worth taking. Because in the end, the most important partnerships weren't built on contracts. They were built on the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, and nobody had to fight alone.